My name is Rosie. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the events coordinator here at Readers, and it's just so much fun to be able to say, welcome back, everyone who's here. So let me tell you a little bit about The Last Professional. We wanted to have this event in January, and Sonoma County said, you're not allowed to have gatherings of more than 10 people. And I said to myself, Ed's going to get more than 10 people. I was right. So instead, we get to be the launch of his Amtrak tour. He's going to spend a month, I think on this round, going on trains. And as someone who grew up in California, I actually didn't see the train as a mode of transport until I went to college, and I got to go on the Hudson line, which is just a beautiful, beautiful train. I don't think I ever really heard the word hobo until my dad told me that he had dressed as one for Halloween for like 15 years of his life. And I remember saying, what's a hobo? So there's this great sense of history and of Americana to The Last Professional. I think part of what makes it such a brilliant story is that Ed did travel on trains and in the hobo life. So he's going to tell you a lot more about it. He's going to tell you the nitty-gritty bits, and I don't want to spoil anything of the plot. So if you guys could give him a really big round of applause. Come on up.
You guys, this is so cool for me. It's thanks for coming. For me, bookstores are sacred places. And our culture in all of its complexity thrives inside these walls, and guys like the folks here at Readers are the keepers of that flame. And so I'm so grateful for you to come and support them and support me. They're an important part of our culture. Some introductions briefly. I've got people here from every aspect of my life, which is amazing. John Four, we figured out that you met me when I was 6 years old. Rich Yonash, who is here, is my best friend from high school. We rode trains together. We've been business partners for 35 years. We've got the discus throwers from Chino Valley. We've got the soup group. We've got the writers group. This is thrilling for me. It's sort of, it's like a this is your life. If any of you who's here is old enough to remember what that was like. So thank you so much. And most importantly, to two people, thanks to Vince Zukowski, my editor. Vince, where are you? Raise your hand. Any writer who says that they can do it without an editor is lying. It's one of the great good fortunes of my life was to encounter Zook. We have worked well together and will continue to. Couldn't have done this without him. And Jan Davis has been with me from the very start. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to read a little bit. I'm going to tell you a bit about my new novel, The Last Professional. It's an adventure about friendship, honor, and identity set among thundering freight trains and the vagabonds who ride them. Then I'll open it up for questions. In the 1970s and early 1980s, I was a part-time hobo. Rich joined me for some of that. I rode extensively around the United States and Canada. The questions I most often get are, what was it like, and how did you get started? As to what it's like, I'm going to read a brief section from a short story I wrote called Rhapsody and Steel. The first time I caught a freight train, it felt as if I had learned how to fly. One moment I was anchored to the ground, feet in the gravel, backpack weighing me down. The next, I was moving through space, transported not by wings, but by tons of straining steel. Becoming airborne wasn't easy. I had to run faster than I believed I could, stretch my muscles past their pulling point, reached beyond my fingers' grasp, like a fledgling leaving his nest for the first time. It's an amazing experience. How did I get started? In 1972, I'd been working at SDC for 2 years with my good friend Paul Morrison. We'd decided we wanted to go find our fathers. Paul didn't know his, I didn't know mine, really. Paul had had a lead that we might be able to find a trace of him on an island off the coast of Scotland. And so we cashed in our chips. I think between us we had $500. We bought $200 round trip open-ended tickets from Kennedy to Heathrow So we knew how we could get that far, but we didn't know how we were going to get to Kennedy. And so it was 1972. Everybody was hitchhiking. We figured we could do that. What could go wrong? I'm 6 foot. Paul's 6'3". We got Army surplus backpacks, wire framed, stuck our thumbs out, and nobody was giving us a ride. After a day of this, a fellow took pity on us up somewhere near Crescent City, picked us up in a van, and said, "You guys are out of your minds. No one is going to stop for you. You're too big. Why aren't you riding freight trains?" And we said, "Well, freight trains? Is that even a thing you can do?" He said, "Yes, I've done it. I'll give you some pointers." So he drove us to Eugene, Oregon, let us off in the freight yard. Half an hour later, we were on a flat car, sun on our backs, wind in our hair. I never looked back. It got me, which was great. So I want to read you a little bit from the novel. It starts with 2 quotes. Here's the first of them. "Brother, have you seen starlight on the rails? Have you heard the thunder of the fast express?" That's from Thomas Wolfe, a guy who knew something about trains. The next is, "Not all those who wander are lost." That's J.R.R. Tolkien, a guy who knew something about wandering. All the chapters begin with epigraphs. They're small passages from poems or songs, almost exclusively written by hobo poets, most of whom are long forgotten. The first chapter begins with this. "So pay attention now, my children, and the old story I will tell about the jungles and the freight trains and a breed of men who fell." A fellow by the name of Virginia Slim wrote that. I'll read you the beginning. "Until the railroad arrived virtually at their doorsteps, most people lived within a day's walk of where they were born. America was smaller. Horizons meant something. The span of a life was measured out in strides. A desire for more, a restlessness of the soul always lay in wait. It was a gnawing in the gut that comfort would abate for most and conformity could subdue for others. Yet in the hearts of some, the compulsion to wonder was so irresistible that they had no choice but to follow. On horseback, on a raft, or on the last of their shoe leather, they would eventually leave everything they knew, seek solace in movement, and go in search of themselves. These pilgrims, who longed for a different path, found that a river of steel had burst to life at their feet. Surging from the midst of the sprawling cities to the smallest hamlets, its tributaries traversed defiant mountain ranges, spanned impossibly vast prairies, and linked to the remotest reaches of the country. Hobos, these pilgrims were called, phantoms of the road, and except to one another, they had no names. The river of steel still flows through the land, but it is a changed land and a changed river. Its tributaries no longer reach into every corner. Its currents are no longer inviting. The hobos that once were are no more, having caught the westbound long ago. At the time of this tale, late in the last century, their golden age was a distant memory, their legacy known to but a dwindling few. So that's the setup for the book. And read you a little bit of the beginning. Some of you are actually getting on a train with Jan and I tomorrow morning to take this very trip that's described here. The country east of Roseville, California, is a gentle plain of grasslands and houses, tilting steadily upwards towards the Sierra Nevada. It's a gradual climb that an automobile wouldn't notice, but the eastbound freight labored at it, all 6 power units throwing thick black smoke into the afternoon sky. In their boxcar, Lynden and the Duke stood like sailors on a rolling deck, hands clasped at their backs, feet wide apart for balance, faces thrust forward into the wind. Their car was like an oven from a day's worth of sun, so they pushed back both doors to catch a cooling breeze. On either side, the great brown landscape peeled by. Hills sloped into the long valley, palisades defined the hollows of the grasslands. The open doors framed the passing scenery like a movie screen, a private showing just for them. For those who haven't had a chance to do it, there is nothing like seeing this country from a train. They move slowly. They go places that cars don't go. And odd as it sounds, for something as big as a train, hundreds of thousands of tons, they're largely ignored. They're almost invisible. So trains go through the hearts of cities. They go through the suburbs. They go through the factories. They go through people's backyards. They're a part of everyday life. And there's no other way to see the country quite so intimately as from the open door of a rolling boxcar. Why did people take to the road? Necessity, opportunity, wanderlust. Most of you can look back in your family trees and find a hobo. There were, in the Depression certainly, there were millions of people riding the rails. They were put there of necessity. And so it's not that uncommon. It started after the Civil War with the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad. Think about it. The biggest conflict this country's ever had ends. All of these people come home. Many of them shell-shocked, injured, coming homes to maybe they don't have any more. Maybe they don't recognize themselves within those homes. And maybe there's no place for them. They don't feel like they belong. What's changed is that suddenly they can walk 5 or 10 miles from their front door and catch a train. There was a time when 90% of the population of this country lived within 5 miles of a train track. Imagine that. It is as life-changing as the internet was for us in the end of the last century. It abolished time and distance. It was amazingly revolutionary. Nothing like it had existed before, and it opened a whole new frontier. What they find there, these guys developed their own language, their own iconography. There were hobo colleges, there were hobo newspapers. This was a place you could make your way, start fresh, and find others who were like you. Why did they stay on the road? Not everybody did. Much of the work in the country was done by hobos who were essentially migrant labor. So bridges, roads, lumber camps, you name it. This is how it worked. Fruit camps. They were welcome when the harvest was coming in and ushered out of town when it was done. So there were 3 categories of people riding the trains. The traditional definitions are hobos worked and wandered, tramps just wandered, and bums didn't either. And so most of the people riding were hobos. They were doing this as necessity. But there was a hierarchy among the hobos. The guys who found something there that they couldn't get anywhere else were professional. They rode to ride, not to get from job to job, but because it fed their soul somehow. And I think analogous to that might be the surfers in California who surf every day regardless of the quality of the surf. Guys who hike the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail every year. People who run 50 marathons a year, climb all the 14 peaks. Something about the activity feeds their soul. It becomes an avocation. So let's see. I'm doing okay without the notes so far, I think. A boxcar may seem like an unlikely place for readers to encounter and reflect on what I think are the fundamental questions good fiction poses. Who are we? How do we fit in? Where do we belong? Yet it is exactly what the main characters in this story are grappling with as they roll slowly over the Sierras, as some of us are going to do tomorrow. Lynden is a computer programmer in his late 20s, returning to the rails to confront traumas of his past. Here's what we know about him. His co-workers, who did not know him well or understand him at all, were sure he'd quit because of the added pressure. Either that or it was a ploy for more money. But it wasn't about money or pressure. He loved programming. Circuits were like barricades for Lynden, equations like battlements. When he brought them together with code, they created a fortress, a realm that was entirely his own, one he could control. He understood every inch of that world, just as prisoners know every inch of their cells. As long as he was in self-imposed solitary, he could convince himself that he was fine. Only yesterday, he'd been offered a promotion that would have made the business section of the Mercury News. Data dynamics, pegged as one of 1983's fastest-growing tech terms, today named Lynden Hoover, age 26, head of product development. Hoover becomes one of the youngest Silicon Valley programmers to hold such a post and possibly the highest paid. But there was no possibility about it. There was also no story. Instead of saying yes, he'd said goodbye. The other main character is a fellow called the Duke. He is the last professional hobo, still writing. He's clinging to a vanishing way of life. From the book, we learn the Duke was not accustomed to being scared. For 2 weeks now, he'd been glancing over his shoulder, and every time, his gut jumped a little. In 50 years on the road, bulls had pistol whipped him, jungle buzzards had knifed him for the change in his pockets, and the killing wheels of the freights had always been there, ever sharpening themselves on the whetstone of the rails. He had seen men die beneath those wheels, seen them sucked in and ripped apart, but none of it had derailed him, not until 2 weeks ago, not until that mess in the jungle outside of the Colton Yards, not until Short Arm. Now he was running. The rails were and are very dangerous. This is the public service portion of our presentation tonight. Do not try this. It's illegal, and it's extraordinarily dangerous, much more so now than when I was doing it, when Rich and I were doing it. The trains are faster, the boxcars aren't open, so don't do it. But I want to give you some sense of how dangerous it was. Between 1901 and 1905, there were 24,000 reported deaths from people riding the trains, and an equal number of injuries. Those numbers got far worse during the Depression, when hundreds of thousands were riding. You could get killed by shifting cargo, you could get scraped off a ladder, you could get pinched between cars, you could get rolled over. And in the early days, you could meet death at the hands of the railroad bulls, the police, who might red light you, which meant throw you from a moving train. There were other dangers. In a society that is invisible, crime's invisible. There were organized criminal gangs on the rails, most notably the Johnson family, who were the opposite of the profession. And lone wolf killers prowled the hobo jungles, picking off easy prey. While that may seem like ancient history, there were much more contemporary equivalents from the years when I was riding and when Rich was riding. In the 1980s and 90s, the FTRA, Freight Train Riders of America, sounds really innocent, emerged. Thieves and thugs who terrorized the rails. They recognized one another by their black bandanas. Their rivals, the blood-bound railroad gang, wore red bandanas, so they knew who was friend, who was foe, and who was neither. In The Last Professional, I've fictionalized that the Johnson family wore brass belt buckles in the shape of a fist for that same purpose. As to the lone wolves, between 1981 and 1996, Robert Joseph Silveria Jr., known as the Boxcar Killer, killed 28 hobos. Angel Resendez, known as the Railroad Killer, killed 23 hobos in the 1990s. Here's a short section from the novel that speaks to the darker aspects of this hidden world. The river of Steel's undercurrents run deep and were often treacherous. Invisible from above, they would pull a man down as effortlessly as pull him along. There was tranquility to be had on the surface, the romance of rolling unfettered through the unfurling landscape, the hypnotic magic of motion, the daily discovery of vistas unknown, horizons unseen, life unfiltered, a world only guessed at and barely comprehended by those who preferred a roof over their heads to a boxcar floor beneath their feet. To navigate these undertows, a traveler on this river needed skill and luck and the acumen earned from the melding of the two. Rules of physics and power made the dangers, if not preventable, at least predictable. Locomotives usually stayed upright on the rails, cars sat still unless pushed or pulled, and the movements of the freights themselves conformed to patterns of behavior that, if never fully understood, could at least be guessed at. No such rules applied to the men who prowled the depths of these waters. Which brings us to Short Arm, the antagonist. This is how we meet him. Short Arm Johnson was thinking about his hand, the one he no longer had. He moved the fingers in his mind, opening and closing them, feeling the tendons stretch up through his wrist. He made a fist and smiled at the way his bicep bulged. But he had no bicep, no hand, no fingers. There was nothing below his right shoulder, almost nothing. It was 2 days since he'd left Salt Lake, and now he was heading back west, heading to Klamath Falls. His old friends had been afraid of him, the ones who remembered anyway. The others too, he thought. Part of it, he knew, was the way he looked. The scars on his face, too many to count, and the set of his eyes, too deep and too narrow to look directly into, had always scared people. And the buckle? Though they might try to conceal their reaction, those who knew what it meant were unable to hide their fear. He could see it, stamped across their foreheads in tightened and twitching muscles that telegraphed like a Morse code only he could read, their barely controllable dread. Or was it his new secret they feared? But no, they didn't know about that, not yet. Only the Duke knew. That was why he had to die. I want to talk for a minute about the illustrations. There are 17 of them in the book, plus the cover. The novels that formed me are really the American fiction of 100 years ago. Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, Hemingway. Literary fiction in those days was often illustrated. I'm not talking about graphic novels, I'm talking about novels with illustrations. Two that really influenced me was the 1934 edition Random House of Moby Dick with woodcuts by Rockwell Kent. If you haven't seen these, you should. They're wonderful. They're a story all by themselves. And the father of our good friend Lee, Giacomo Patri, in White Collar, did lino cuts. They're like woodcuts but in linoleum. It's considered to be the first graphic novel because it tells an entire story almost without words. So I was looking for someone who could do something like that. I went online and I was so fortunate to bump into Colin Elgee. You can see one of Colin's illustrations here. I showed him the style I was interested in. He came back with things that looked right. I had no idea when we were doing this that he had worked for Hypnosis, the design firm out of London, who did album covers for Pink Floyd and the Hollies and Genesis and all of these groups we grew up with. So it's been a thrill for me to be able to add this element to the story. I started writing this novel 40 years ago, one night in a boxcar outside Watsonville, California. I did it by the light of a passing streamliner. I wrote the first words. Let me read you that passage now. Somewhere a hobo is waiting. He sits on an old wooden box, a small fire of twigs and branches burning between his outstretched legs. As he blows on cupped hands, the steam of his breath and the smoke of his fire rise to mingle with the morning vapors. His pants are gray and loose, his shoes brown and shapeless. The fire's heat draws the scent of leather, earth, grass from his garments, and these smells combine with the fire's own fragrance to make a rich, sustaining aroma, a nourishment for his particular hunger. His quick breaths drink in the odors, nostrils stinging from the sharp morning air. All night, he's waited by the fire, standing every few minutes to hold his coat open, capture the fire's energy, and stave off the cold. Hugging the coat tightly around him, he presses the trapped heat into his skin. Now the sun is up. Its warmth is stretching across his shoulders, sinking through his jacket and through his back, clear into his bones. Waiting will be easier now. A sound breaks the morning stillness, singular and unearthly, as it echoes towards him. Again it comes, the sure, clear blowing of a southbound freight, his freight. This illustration is based on me waiting for a train in Dunsmuir, California. It was the first one Colin did, and he just nailed it. So I'd like to open it up for questions. Don't all start at once.
I have a question there.
Sure.
First of all, I want to say your writing is just beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Just beautiful. I know you wanted to write this book for a long time. I was wondering if you could speak to the process of how you developed the storyline and the main characters.
It's a great question. The book wrote itself very quickly. So people wonder 40 years ago and quickly, how do those two things go together? At that time, I had decided I wanted to be a writer, and I'll digress a little bit. The first trip that I took across Canada with my friend Paul Morrison, Jan and I were newly together, newly in love. I had discovered this passion for riding trains, and I was writing her letters under lampposts, in boxcars, anywhere I could. And somehow the writing brought these two things together in sort of an alchemy that just gave me a lot of what I knew I wanted more of. So I knew then that I wanted to be a writer. We cashed in our chips and decided to give me a year to write. And I wrote this novel, I wrote another novel, I wrote a short story a day for a month. I wrote a novel in 7 days. I just pumped out volume. Got an agent, got another agent, wrote a second novel. We got close to sales but couldn't make them. And so, young family coming along, it was time to change direction. And that was okay. I have no regrets about doing it. Those of you who are familiar with The Natural, the Bernard Malamud story, or the Robert Redford movie, I feel somewhat like that sometimes, that I started as a rookie when I was in my 20s, and I've come back as a almost 70-year-old rookie now, getting back into the game. I never stopped thinking about it. In terms of the characters, I think the best fiction is mostly autobiographical. I think the best writing comes from our own experience. So the young character, Lynden, is based on me. And that's who I identified with in 1980. When I came back to the book 6-7 years ago, I was identifying with the older character because I was his age. Interestingly, I've come back to identifying with Lynden now. And the reason is, I think all of us share this in common. We think we've put our traumas behind us. We think we're we're just going to move forward. We've dealt with this, it's okay. Lynden thought he had to, but he hadn't. And so now, as an almost 70-year-old, I'm back with him.
Where are you going next with your writing?
I finished a long novel called Four and Stone. It's about Sebastopol. And it's done. Thank God for Vince, and for many of you who saw chapters of it. I wrote it as a serial. I sent it out a chapter at a time. It's finished. The plan at this point is to build a larger audience with The Last Professional, and then see where we can go with that one. And then there's a collection of short stories also that take place in the same town. Vince and I are working on putting those together now. There's a question back there.
Yeah. Will you ever hop a freight again?
No. Although, Chuck, I can't hear a train whistle without wanting to. Cute story, Jan and I, when we first got our pop-up trailer, we camped in Dunsmuir, Sally, Dunsmuir, your hometown. And the one warning we got from the campground there, people were saying that, the trains go by all night. You won't get an ounce of sleep. We loved it. It was just right.
Yeah, my stereotype of a hobo before I read your book was a person that was a loner and didn't really, wasn't attracted to interaction with other people. In your book, I was impressed with how people-oriented some of the hobos were. Is that what is your experience?
Well, my experience was they sort of fell into two categories, and many of the guys who were more social in the book had become what was called home guard. They'd mostly stopped writing, and so they would stay permanently in a hobo jungle. And hobo jungles, for those of you who don't know, were every town that had a railroad yard had a hobo jungle. In the days before diesel, the trains required a lot of fuel and a lot of water, so which meant that they stopped. That's why they were so easy to ride. And so there were hobo jungles all across the country. The professional hobos, the guys who were moving fast, they weren't particularly social. They kept to themselves. They were soft-spoken, little-spoken at all. You could get them, the ones I was fortunate enough to ride with, you could get them to talk a bit if it was about riding trains. They didn't want to talk about anything else. So your stereotype perception is not off the mark. It really isn't.
Were there any women that rode the trains?
Jan, she's standing right back there. But seriously, to your question, particularly during the Great Depression, everybody rode. There were a lot of kids riding. And the common story was you've got a farm that's barely making it, and there's 7 kids. And the oldest one says, I'm a burden here, I should go out on my own. And the trains made it possible to do that. Women were unusual. And this was a rough life. It was a really rough life.
This is a hard question.
Uh-oh.
So how did you work up the courage to fold the sex abuse into your story?
It's a great question. The thing that Lynden and I share in common is we were both abused as children. And what I alluded to earlier about identifying with him earlier and then coming back to him now, I've come to understand in the last few years that our traumas don't go away. We push them down, we move forward because it's what we have to do. It's how we get through life. But just because we've done that doesn't mean we've dealt with them. And so that's really what he is doing here, and frankly, through writing the book this second time around, what I've been doing. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
So the tracks section of the book, how did that come about? Was it there from the beginning? It reminded me a little bit of Grapes of Wrath, and that was another question.
Boom! That's great.
Give that man a prize.
Yeah. How much did we pay him to say that? Ron, that's a really good question, and I don't want to keep you guys sitting there too long, but it leads to a really interesting thing for folks who are interested in writing. So they were there from the start. The book was, 200,000 words. And when I came back to it 5 or 6 years ago, I started shopping it around again. I went to editors, I went to agents, went to editors, and I hooked up with a good editor and agent in LA, and they were crafting it towards being a movie. And so the first thing they did was threw all of that out. And I got some good advice from Sarah Gruen, who wrote Water for Elephants. One of the things that she told me was get them on the train immediately, start on the train, which is one of the things I did. So I took this book that was pretty big, shrunk it down, and it was mostly action. And I decided it wasn't the book I wanted anymore. So once Vince and I finished working on Four in Stone, I said, I've got now 2 books because I changed the title. It had become called River of Steel. It was no longer The Last Professional. And so literally, Vince and I sat down with this one here and this one here, went through a page at a time, and took the things we wanted to keep and knitted them back together. And so that's what brought us to this book. Great question. So the question is problems with bulls, problems getting on the trains, how to deal with the law. And fortunately, when I was writing, they were nothing like the bulls during the Depression. These guys, the bulls and the conductors on the train, who were called shacks, would carry big clubs, and they would just club you to death. They didn't care. When I was writing, fortunately, a lot of the guys working in the yards had ridden as kids. Because they had to get around and work. So if you were respectful, didn't look like you were trying to steal something, said, mister, I'm trying to get to Roseville. Where should I catch a train? They tell you where. My secret weapon, though, for getting busted, and I got busted plenty, was having Jan with me. Because while I tried to talk my way out of it, Jan would just cry. It was perfect. It was perfect. Guys, this has been great. I can't thank you enough. We've got lots of refreshments out here. I'll be back there signing books. This is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for me. Thank you so much for making it.